welcome everyone. So I'm Virginie Bonneau, and I will introduce this evening. So as the director of Cité du Genre, I have the great pleasure of introducing Shivani Gupta's masterclass today. Cité du Genre is a multidisciplinary institute that promotes training and research in gender studies at Université Paris Cité, as well as among its privileged partners across the Alliance Sorbonne Paris Cité, Sciences Po, INALCO, and Université Sorbonne Paris Nord. I encourage you to check our website for more information about our activities and events. Today we are delighted to welcome Shivani Gupta, who is a visiting scholar at Sciences Po this term, within the framework of a partnership between UP Cité and Sciences Po that allows students to attend masterclasses on gender topics. This is the third one hosted by Cité du Genre Présage after those by Brenda Allegre in the spring and Leda Perez in October. And there's plenty more to come, so keep an eye on our information from Cité du Genre and Présage. Shivani Gupta is a feminist anthropologist interested in examining how everyday gendered experiences in urban settings are articulated and negotiated by gender minorities through precepts of violence, surveillance, mobilities, fear, morality, and honor, rooted in social structures. She holds a PhD from the Department of South Asian Studies, National University of Singapore. And prior to joining NUS College as a lecturer, she was a postdoctoral fellow at the Communication and New Media Department at NUS on a project that investigated campus sexual violence, including technology facilitated in Singapore. Today she will talk about rising cases of sexual violence in higher education institutions and the insensitive ways in which victims, survivors of sexual violence are implicated in the management of such cases. And she will also discuss methods of caring for victims, survivors of sexual violence. So thank you very much, Shivani, for agreeing to give this lecture and to share your insights with us today. And I also introduce, before your talk, you welcome three discussants. Just in front here. So Yara Mahfoud, she's an assistant professor in social psychology at Université Paris Cité, a member of Cité du Genre, and referent for equality, diversity, and inclusion at the Institute of Psychology, Université Paris Cité. And she works on the links between integration models and anti-Muslim prejudices, as well as on online masculinist movements. Victor Poutolo, here, from Sciences Po Gender Studies program, who currently works as a postdoctoral researcher on the Safe Edu project, led by Présage and Cité du Genre, that investigates sexual and sexist violence within our institutions. And Clara Le Gallic-H, who is here, a research assistant on the Safe Edu project, and now a doctoral researcher in sociology at Sciences Po Center for Research on Social Inequalities, and the French Institute for Demographic Studies. Before giving you the floor, and it's the last word I'll say, I also wish to thank Mathilde Croquet, Violette Toyer from Sciences Po, and Wenjing Wu from Cité du Genre et Cité for the operational organization of this conference. Thank you all for coming tonight.
So first, bonsoir, good evening. Thank you for coming for the talk. Before I begin, I would like to thank Sciences Po, Université Paris Cité, Présage, Cité du Genre for awarding me this visiting faculty fellowship, having me here, hosting me, and being very kind and caring, which is very important. And I'll be leaving soon, but I must say, I've had amazing time at Paris, Sciences Po, and engaging with members at Université Cité Paris. It's been a pleasure. And I would like to also thank Center for European Studies and Comparative Politics for hosting me, and of course Yara, Victor, and Clara for engaging with me and constantly having to hear me talk about sexual violence, which is not the most pleasant thing. And so for that, and Violet, Mathilde, and Wenjing for organizing this and constantly bearing with my delays and all of that has happened throughout the last few weeks. So before I begin, I'm not really going to discuss the details of the incidences, but there might be points where you feel uncomfortable or you might feel like you're not okay to listen. Please feel free to walk out, and that's completely fine. You don't have to. Also, there might be things you might want to talk about, but not in the question answer round. I'll stay back, and if there are any questions or you just want to chat about something, please feel free to do so. I'll be here. And if by any chance you feel re-traumatized or anything, please reach out and maybe we'll find options about what we can do further. So yeah, but feel free to walk out or come back in however you want. Not the best of the topics where you can say, yes, I want to stay till the end, but yeah, okay. So I'm going to be reading out, that's something I've always done, and I guess it's a trait of an anthropologist, so I'll try to modulate my voice to make sure you don't go off to sleep. Okay, so here I go. And I quote, "An act of violence produces one as a victim. It's the journey and support that one receives in the aftermath of the violence that makes one a survivor." These words were said to me by Rosa, a 22-year-old victim survivor of sexual violence that occurred on campus in Singapore. These words have stayed with me ever since. If there is a journey to be tread to become a survivor from a victim, what does the journey entail? My interview with Rosa was conducted in 2021 when I was studying sexual violence on university and college campuses in Singapore for my postdoctoral fellowship. Is anyone surprised that there are cases of violence in Singapore? Yes, Singapore is considered one of the safest countries in the world, especially for women. Moreover, it's known for its exceptional implementation and execution of policies. Yet in 2020, there were 4 cases of sexual violence that were reported and made public by National University of Singapore, or NUS. The same university where my study gave me access to 32 victim survivors of sexual violence, of which 20 were victim survivors and 12 identified themselves as victim survivors as well as support persons to victim survivors. The difference in my research versus the reports that became public speaks volumes of the way institution is perceived and viewed by victim survivors and vice versa. The suspicion, anxiety, and frustration that victim survivors carry with them, I argue, are a lack of result of the care that institution and their mechanisms do not bestow. Thus, the journey from victim to survivor is either incomplete or unfulfilled. Contrarily, this produces victim survivors as bodies that need to carry the burden of proof, appear as good victims, and constantly assert their merit to be taken seriously. Furthermore, a lot of harm is done in the guise of justice, and care is produced in formats that perpetuate further violence and victimization. As Roskin Farzi states, care should not be neglected in the name of justice. In this presentation, through my own experience of working with students who are victim survivors of sexual violence, I argue that care comprises a crucial analytical category and a grounded way to address sexual violence that is victim survivor centric. So what is sexual violence? Violence is an everyday phenomenon that surrounds us in its various forms. The reason for it is its continuity and repetition premised on systemic and structural validation by patriarchy and its resultant paternalism via multiple institutions and expression. In this manner, sexual violence is an unwanted, damaging sexual act against an individual in the absence of active consent. Definitionally, at least, many university policies have framed sexual harassment to include written, verbal, physical, mental, and visual practices carrying sexual intent and connotation, which are essentially coercive acts of domination based on unequal power relationship. These acts cause harm physically, emotionally, and psychologically. Sexual violence, as feminist scholars have argued, has nothing to do with desire and sex itself, but a way to assert power and domination. Relatedly, Catherine McKinnon states that sexual violence is an abuse of power and not sexuality. However, attitudinally, there has been a tendency to focus on the more spectacular, visible, horrific behaviors, physical groping or touching, upskirt videos, molestations, sexual assault and rape as more real, more serious, and more worthy of institutional attention. The hierarchization of violence has given an undeniable value to evidence that undermines justice and in turn invisibilizes insidious forms of sexual violence and gender violence. And such institutions are androcentric and speak to each other seamlessly to maintain the status quo. Marginalized genders mainly experience sexual violence premised on intersectional situatedness. In recent study, it is known that 60% of university-going women and 21% of individuals from LGBTQI plus communities in college setting experience sexual violence. This implies that in addition to your gender, your other identities on the matrix of domination define the extent to which you experience violence and are blamed for it, as well as how you are treated in the aftermath. Religion, race, age, community, caste, and class are important intersecting identities in defining violence and its consequences. Johanna Berg explains that every individual experiences sexual violence differently, and therefore to think of it as a universal experience is to perpetuate further harm and, I quote, insult the specificities of individual histories, end quote. Therefore, sexual examination of sexual violence is imperative to make the discourse victim-survivor centric. Hence, while violence is a ubiquitous reality of society, it needs to be investigated for social justice while privileging the well-being of people, dignity, and equality for those involved, especially victim survivors of sexual violence. Veena Das, a renowned anthropologist, whose works examine violence as everyday discourse in women's life, argues that violence has the capacity to unmake, but also remake one's world. In this presentation, I take this argument of remaking the world in post-violence scenario and look at care as a phenomenon and a grounded technique to understand how sexual violence can be dealt with from a victim-survivor-centric approach. So, the sexual violence discourse, this form of logic in sexual violence enters the institutional spaces of college and university. Bell Hooks has observed powerfully that teaching is fundamentally about liberation. She asked how the latter is possible if spaces of teaching and learning insinuate violence against the vulnerable and reinforces dominant forms of power without care. Neoliberal institutions which remain conservative view education as a service to be provided, where the client-service provider relationships do not provide space to evaluate human emotions and relations. This is to state that institutions of higher learning, or HEIs as I would say from here on, remain no different where masculinist and androcentric discourse overshadow the voices and needs of the marginalized by keeping them in check. In this context, Anne Barthos argues that women's bodies are sites where structural power differentials work out in violent ways. The widespread prevalence of patriarchal structure and male-oriented norms and practices in tertiary institutional environments explain both the high levels of sexual violence and low degrees of formal reporting. Various studies on sexual and gender violence on university and college campuses report a drastic increase in number, while reporting numbers have not seen much of a change. So I've used two examples of US and the UK. But there was a larger data set created looking at Western countries where it stated that 1 among 6 students experienced some form of sexual violence on college campus. In contrast, only 6% report the crimes. Of those, only 2% were satisfied with the management of cases. So in the context of US, 43, so campus sexual assault created one of the largest greatest proportion of the crime. 90% of assaults are not reported. LGBTQI, as stated earlier, LGBTQI individuals experience higher cases of sexual violence. In context of the UK, 70% of female responded, of which 73% able students experience higher sexual violence. This has already been stated. If you look at 2% are satisfied, which means 0.1% of the rate. And 57% of the victims are known rather than unknown, and 35% do not report just because they feel ashamed to report. Okay. What is troubling about these cases within an educational institutions emerge from the fact that these spaces exist for young and vulnerable students to learn, self-actualize, and become concerned and active citizens of society to the best of their abilities. In this regard, universities and HEIs have a responsibility to protect their staff and students. Therefore, every harm reduces the goal and creates a distortion that has a long-term effect. Distortion that is manifested in self-harm, low self-confidence, low self-esteem, social and psychological anxiety, depression, bodily dysphoria, relationship issues, loss of dignity and integrity, amongst others. In this regard, a student cannot be an active part of college and consume and engage within academic environments as supposed. Therefore, HEI has become a crucial site for scrutinizing this issue where futures and aspirations are not only produced, but members of society to shape the world are also produced. In this regard, I argue that one of the dominant reasons for high levels of violence and low reporting rates is addressing and viewing sexual violence as an exception and not an everyday occurrence, as discussed previously. In posing it as exception, multitudes of problems arise. First, there is a suspicion of the institution of the victim survivor's motivation for reporting, as this exceptionality of needs to be validated in the exceptionality of individuals encountering violence. This would imply an explanation of why a particular victim and survivor was attacked. What could they have done to receive the harm or attack? What were they doing during the attack? What were they wearing? These questions emerge from seeing the individual as an exception to others who have not experienced violence, and thereby reinforcing vulnerabilities and with the victim survivors as well as of the marginalized individual. This further leads to burdening victim survivors with proof, as well as creating an environment of blame and self-blame instantly. Second, the distance of violence as an everyday phenomenon requires the victim survivor to lose all of their other identities and take the singular role of the victim. Any deviation becomes an argument against their violation and appear as bad victim or a vindictive victim. Third, while institutions keep their reputation intact and the discourse of exceptionalism, they produce an environment where victim survivors feel ashamed to voice their experiences, for they feel, I quote, they are the only ones, end quote. Lastly, exceptionalism further harms rather than saves the reputation of the institution because it gets labeled as the exceptional site of violence, ironically. Thus, a vital act for institution is to move away from the discourse of violence as an exceptional occurrence, but one where cases are handled with sensitivity, care, and inclusivity that restores dignity, confidence, and worthiness of an individual. In doing so, institution prospects lie in being known for their progressiveness and considered approach to violence. This is also because there is no running away from violence unless institutions are changed structurally. And I contend that care is the most vital factor for this change to come along. Care. What do I mean by care? Care is a complex term to define. It's an act and a practice. But to articulate it concretely becomes a difficult task. We know what care feels like, but are usually not asked what it means, especially in the everyday, as it is taken for granted and remains heavily gendered. This is what I have done by looking at the experiences of students who identify as victim survivors of sexual violence. I tried to understand what care would mean and look like that from the perspectives of their perspective, and how institutions can enact and execute these care practices. Once again, to go back, the general essence of the word care implies immediate and long-term practice that looks after individuals' well-being and healing for them to feel safe, comfortable, supported, encouraged, actualized, and reassured in the aftermath of violence while enabling them to repair their worlds. Yet care is not a value-neutral phenomenon. It would be naive to think of care practice as exclusively nurturing and enabling. Samina Mullah, in her work Violence of Care, looks at various institutions that perpetuate further violence in the name of care, especially medical and legal institutions. In this regard, non-care is enveloped in the discourse and processes of what is termed care and produced as care. And Bartos defines non-care practices as those that cause harm and violations at the expense of caring for someone else. This is because society unequally attributes value to certain bodies, which enables non-care to perpetuate against the marginalized. Furthermore, care in stereotypical ways is expected by women to be undertaken in feminine ways, while violence is also perpetuated against them in deeply paradoxical ways. Thus, patriarchal institutions become non-caring agencies, for they are governed by dominant masculinist scripts and norms. I assert from the research I've done that the cost for institutions for non-care is their reputation and ranking, which determines long-term funding. Of course, the funding is crucial and needs to be taken into account for the improvement and growth of the institution. But how do institutions do right by their population without furthering and causing damage to their physical, emotional, social, psychological, and economic being? Borrowing Ruskin Farazi's assertion once again that care cannot be neglected in name of justice. And there has to be a reduction in strengthening of the politics of exceptionalism. It's within this paradigm I want to use ethics of care as one of the analytical lenses to understand sexual violences and how we can use care as to understand, to make the entire process victim-survivor centric. Ethics of care understands the value and necessity of caring labor and emphasizes the values of empathy, sensitivity, trust, and responding to the need of victim survivors as argued by Virginia Held. If we employ this understanding within an institutional setting, it requires adopting a lens through which everyday experiences of the disenfranchised are made visible. Therefore, ethics of care requires interrogating the persistence violence, particularly related to marginalized bodies, where care is given as much importance as justice, and thereby accepting violence as an everyday phenomenon. This also addresses that when victim survivors interact with various stakeholders, there is a continuity and discontinuity in who they are and what they become in relation to institutional spaces and processes. As argued by urban scholars, spaces are constantly in state of becoming, never finished, and always remain relational. Just one second. Sorry. Yeah, always remain relational. Relatedly, spaces of violence, trauma, and stigma can, through a victim-centric approach, possesses the possibility of becoming caring, inclusive, conducive, and do not have to remain spaces of harm. To discuss how care in relational spaces can be brought about, I used my fieldwork where I conducted an interview between year 2021-2022 with students between the ages of 22 to 40. Out of 32 interviews, 28 were women and 4 were men. The study was conducted during the COVID-19 pandemic, and most of the interviews were conducted on Zoom platform. The students registered themselves to be interviewed through an open call sent to various departments across the university. I'll be discussing parts of the interview that were about commentary on institutional responses to violence and how victims and survivors process such responses. There was a persistent use of the word care and its absence in engaging and enabling those affected by violence. While the cases are drawn from a particular university, the idea of care or lack thereof resonates with numerous victim survivors in universities across the globe. So going forward, I have to tell you there is a lot of anger when institutional response is discussed, so pardon the language that's about to come. They don't give a shit about us. Can at least pretend to care, end quote. Ariana, a 22-year-old fourth-year undergraduate student, spoke these words. She had directly gone to the police after the incident occurred. After the police took action against the perpetrator, she informed the university official in charge of managing sexual and gender-based violence cases about the incident. She told me that the first reaction from the custodians was to aggressively scold her for not reporting it to the university first, but taking the case to the police directly. She said while she was at the office, different people showed their displeasure at her having gone to the authorities outside of the campus and not taking guidance from the unit designed specially for sexual violence cases. While narrating this incident to me, she stated, I quote, "While I was in there, no one even once asked me how I was doing. How was I managing? Did I need anything? Could they assist me with anything?" End quote. Ariana experienced indignation at the hands of the authorities for doing what she assumed to be suitable for her. According to her, the hostility comes from the fact that the university would not have wanted the incident to have gone outside to the public sphere, as they might, or also they might have asked her not to report the incidents. They might have swept it under the carpet or even gaslit her. For Ariana, it was a moment of pride that she was able to approach the police and act independently. But the university's reaction infuriated her. In this regard, the university, as per her experience, could have, at bare minimum, pretended and I emphasize pretended to care, by asking her how she was doing rather than caring for its reputation, which we have discussed is a reason for low reporting influenced by politics of exceptionalism. Ariana reinstated that care is never a priority. Therefore, in Ariana's case, care comprises of reaching out to the victim, survivor, by checking in on her and expressing confidence in her decision, providing comfort and letting her know they are there for her. She further commented that care in an institution expressing trust in the victim survivors' stories and not making them feel ashamed for what they have experienced or done since the violence occurred. Ariana also expressed that institutions do not expect the victims to immediately articulate their violence, as it is a difficult process, but a constant reassurance that university is there for them when they do decide to articulate is very important to increase the reporting rates. These demands and suggestions appear simple, yet go amiss, producing non-care by eroding the future trust of victim survivors within institutional processes. The incident further highlights that workers, staff in the units that handle cases of sexual violence need continuous and repetitive training that privileges care, sensitivity, and inclusivity, that treats victim survivor needs and dignity as a priority rather than viewing themselves as aides of the institution they need to protect. Consequently, care becomes a scalar concept. It can be reduced to a minimal action like pretending to care, or be moved up to make drastic positive changes. Ariana's case pitches the care at minimal level, whereas the recommendation to train the staff primarily involved in such cases takes it to one level up. In this manner, care can be understood as a spectrum, as we'll see with the cases going forward. I quote, "Care is never a priority. What do you expect? Where do you expect the care to come from? Not the university, for sure." Rin, a 23-year-old undergraduate student, also in her final year, explained the ways an unsafe environment is created for victim survivors. Rin experienced violence from a classmate who used to be a close friend. She initially struggled to comprehend the incident, to accept that what had transpired between them was an act of assault. Her biggest fear and anxiety was having to encounter the perpetrator every day during classes and in other spaces and during other activities. In order to minimize the contact between her and the perpetrator, Rin approached anti-sexual violence, sexual and gender-based violence unit to report only in order to get the no contact order established, which is part of the anti-sexual violence policy at NUS. The no contact order, which includes a no communication directive, is a university order which imposes limits on the locations where two members of the university community may be present in order to limit them from being in the same location. If the order is broken, university decides on the penalty contingent on the scale of the violation. Rin views the no contact order as a safety measure provided through a sexual violence policy against possible retaliation or unwanted contact. According to Rin, one of the reasons she decided to file a complaint was to establish no contact order. But the university took a long time and kept requiring her to narrate the incident and explain the situation repeatedly, which further traumatized her. By the time the no contact order was established, the perpetrator had further misbehaved with her. In this case, Rin sees an aspect of anti-sexual violence policy and an act of care possible by the institution. Yet it was not given priority, even though she kept requesting for it to be done. Some universities view policy as a measure to protect its community and be responsible for them. Yet sexual violence cases have not only demonstrated the failure of, but how it is wielded in violent ways to stigmatize the victim survivors further. If a no contact order was established, which was entirely in university's jurisdiction and would not have harmed either party in any case, Rin would have experienced care, or what she terms as care, whereas safety and boundaries would have been respected. She did not demand anything out of the ordinary, but something that is very much part of the policy. Relatedly, care can come in implementing and executing policies as designed. Rin was left feeling that no one believed her or thought of her as a valuable part of the community, which was furthered by her belonging to a marginalized ethnic community. Thus, the policy itself is not enough and cannot ever be until it is explained, implemented, and executed in ways that privilege both care and justice. And once again, to reinstate Ruskin Farzi, care cannot be neglected in the name of justice. helter-skelter everywhere, panic and chaos everywhere, but not to care for the victim survivors, but for damage control. Angela, a 22-year-old woman in a final year of undergraduate studies, made this statement. She was commenting on the Me Too movement that ushered in multiple reports of sexual violence at the university. She claimed that rather than approaching the victim survivors and ensuring their well-being or taking into account the systemic nature of violence, the stir did not change, the immediate stir about and the conversation about the issue did not change the attitude towards the issue of sexual violence in the HIs, but HEIs were pushed to address the issue of immediate damage control. Numerous statements were issued, sexual violence policies were put under scrutiny, new people were brought on board to design a curriculum around sex and consent, but the needle barely moved. You realize there is no care in any of the above initiative because if you care the victim survivors how they felt about their cases being handled, you will hear not only of dissatisfaction, but of re-traumatization, victimization, passive aggression, and dismissive attitude, in addition to the constant creation of self-doubt. Because Angela was constantly asked, "Are you sure? Are you sure?" The victim survivors I interviewed expressed how their violated bodies became a site to show the university as a responsible space to the public, board of trustees, grantors, and others. There were constant commentaries on how the institutions were making drastic changes without ever asking the victim survivors what changes they needed and wanted, or what changes they deemed would enable victim survivors. Rather, victim survivors were given piecemeal consolation for their cases were being investigated, but these investigations did not have any kind of follow-ups, accountability, or regular check-ins. And the perpetrators were issued various penalties, and when the investigation was culminated, the perpetrators were issued various penalties, including expulsion and suspension. One of the victim survivors told me, "I'm not sure if I wanted the perpetrator to be expelled." In contrast, another victim survivor explained that one semester suspension was a joke, and it would not make any difference to the perpetrator's life, whereas she would have to live with trauma all her life. This would bring forward Joanna Burke's argument that there's a multiplicity of experiences and the needs of victim survivors that is defined by intersectional positioning, and one solution cannot be applied to all. Unifying and equating them as to be of the same nature and the people of the same needs is an injustice in itself. According to Angela, the wave of Me Too was an opportunity to bring those voices and desires of victim survivors to the forefront and to change the way institutions think of sexual violence. Instead, they use the cases to assert politics of exceptionalism while putting their best foot forward to save the reputation of the institution. In this case, the thought of care, where a sincere, deep discussion and involvement of various stakeholders in order to provide confidence, safety, and reassurance would have changed the manner in which future cases were handled, but it became about public pleasing. Therefore, if care was mitigated, it has a possibility of countering violence. After everything I did, I took steps that made me scared and drove me out of my wits. I was worried that I'll never be viewed as a human, but just a complaining, accusing being. I didn't feel my trauma was ever addressed or my stigmatization ever stopped. But even my simple demands were viewed as if I was asking for the entire system to be overhauled, end quote. These words were of Sonia, a graduate student who had experienced a severe form of sexual violence. It took her a long time to report the issue because for her to narrate the incident required strength, which took a while. Once she reported, she could see the attitudes of people around her change. She was not just a student who experienced the violence, but a woman who had experienced the violence and then decided to report it and take it to the public court. Her only demand during the court proceeding was somebody would accompany her during the court trials from the university to support her, as well as arrange counseling sessions for her post-trials. Both these requests were denied. Once again, these demands are simple, but the attitude of the institution to not get involved or fear of getting involved changes the spaces of care to non-care. This also resonates with Uma, another victim survivor, who told me, and I quote, "How can institutions care for you when all they desire is for the cases to simply go away? They do not want to put any effort into actually dealing with the cases, especially victim survivors. It is for this reason that universities become gatekeepers and set up units with barely any resources and autonomy," end quote. This creates a non-supportive environment and frustrations and suspicion of universities, and who does that actually university support? According to Sortrovik, this is done to protect institutional gender power dynamic and to maintain organization stability for self-interest. In this regard, care is a notion that is not demanding, but the basic expectation of human communication and relationship that expresses sympathy, empathy, sensitivity, and support on various grounds. The reason these are never present within institutional setting is because when cases emerge, the focus is not on victim survivors, but the institution itself. Institutions have managed to create the superficial binary of rational and emotions based on gender. Masculinity and androcentrism are deeply entrenched in paternalism that appears as responsible, but as a way to keep those in power secure, as numerous scholars studying sexual violence and HEIs have highlighted. The institution that is bogged down by saving its reputation and assuring qualities of exceptionalism misses out on reassuring victim survivors that they are on the side of the violated. The controversies around false reporting, obsessions with future of the perpetrator, and reading of younger women as over-sexualized has provided institutions scapegoats to not address sexual violence with the same consideration it deserves. Therefore, care, through acknowledgement of everyday experiences of the disenfranchised, can be made more visible. Relatedly, ethics of care can help us to listen to the views of others and try to understand their point of view. Care inherently involves attentiveness to others, responding to needs, and its values prepare us to do what is needed to reduce and undermine trends towards violence. Care is the basis of human relations, without which humanity cannot grow and sustain. In every stage of our lives, we expect care. But unfortunately, we locate it only in intimate spaces and relations. Contrary to this notion, care is required in any space where human relations exist for well-being and self-actualization for not only the individual but of the collective society. When violence devastates a person's life and fractures the everyday, yes, one requires law, policy, and various institutional mechanisms for justice, but at the end of the day, one relies on one's immediate environment for support, reassurance, and above all, care. Care needs to become a form and not care in guise of support. Just addressing the needs, desire, and assessment of victim survivors over the years will enable in executing care concretely. Every little step taken towards victim survivors' need adds towards care. Yet there remains a massive frustration on the part of those involved in units that manage these cases. They are not given enough autonomy to make a difference, are overburdened with cases and demands of the administration, and usually belong to marginalized identities themselves where their voices are easily dismissed. Therefore, there has to be investment in establishing independent units with enough resources and autonomy, creating members of the staff as well as the student, and creating smaller support groups that are available outside of the formal reporting mechanisms. While these seem idealistic, these steps can be actualized for care that remains intrinsic for human relationships in any settings. And the politics of exceptionalism has to be done away with as we move forward and see reporting cases of sexual violence. Thank you. So I have to say, I'm creating this kind of not a timeline, but like this thread where I'm writing every act that a victim survivor said could mean care, from absolutely little. And I've already collected 42. And it's a long thing, and I was planning to show, but I didn't know how to. And I'm still working how it can actually mean for institutions to look at these every little steps of care, and I'm still working with it, but it's still in progress, so yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Seniority first.
Okay, so I have a question. Thank you very much for your presentation.
session, and everything was very interesting. It's not. So how my question is linked to my interest, and I hope it's okay for you. How can we manage as a researcher how our personal positioning and emotional involvement in a topic where our own experience or personal struggles resonate with the study?
Okay, so thank you. That's a really good question. It's about methodology, and I think the ethics of research tells you to create a distance between the people you're interviewing, people who are victims of violence. So you're supposed to engage with them, be sympathetic, but not intervene. So intervention is absolutely not expected, and you should not intervene, of course. But of course, there are moments where there are a lot of experiences that overlap. There are moments when you want to reach out, and you should reach out. But again, you should not intervene. So, like I was saying, one of the ways I actually create a safe space to talk to victim survivors is I tend to share my own experience, if I have, of being a victim survivor. To create a space where the politics of exceptionalism is destabilized a bit, where they feel like, okay, it has happened to you, it could happen to me, or it has happened to me, it has happened to other people. So it creates a conducive space where you don't feel like you're the only one, or you need to give merit for why you are a good victim. So I think, relationality has to happen, and I think as researchers, when we get into the field, of course we don't ask, are you sure? Because our research agenda has set it up as such that we don't. But I think we should refrain from using the same institutional language. I think that's one way of engaging without overstepping the boundaries of oneself as a researcher, I think. Of course, do not intervene. You can always provide guidance on what can be done, but you should not intervene, because institutions won't take that very kindly, and you don't know what the consequence of intervention would be. So, does that answer?
Yes, thank you very much.
Perhaps I can continue, because my question is kind of in the continuity of yours. I'm sorry, because it's going to seem very researcher-centric, because my question is also about researchers. It's connected with this idea that we've got these professional ethics that say that we shouldn't intervene.
Yeah.
And I think it's also something that is still in the training. At least it was when I was in graduation and post-graduation. I don't know if it's still the case for you, but you've got this teaching behind it. The problem is that when we are doing qualitative work, we are human beings, and as you said, we are sort of forced to do some form of care, but we have to improvise it, and we are not formed for it. It's not that's part of the job, and we have to sometimes do stuff that are not recommended because we don't have any training in it.
Yes.
So regarding this, I have one main question, but that is going to be split in three sub-questions. So feel free to privilege one part of it and not the others. The first one is so should we try to implement a form of training in care? And of course, my first guess would be yes, it would be a good idea and so on, but here comes the difficult part, is how do we implement it, in which form? Because I think when you do some teaching, you know that the worst service you can do to a topic is to turn it into a class, because it's sort of turning it into this sort of, let's say, not engaging topic, sort of boring, the kind of stuff you need to work for your exams and so on. How do we implement it in a way that is engaging? And it comes with another more general question, a worry, that is, can care survive institutionalization? Because I feel that most of the time the violence we have to deal with is caused by institutions. And institutions tend to have this very broad approach, they do strict procedures, strict guidelines and so on. And they always try to do what you said, that was to provide a single solution to something that is more diverse. And so can care survive institutionalization, and the final sub-question is if we do not have like this more general change in the institution, I'm wondering if as researchers, when we are trying to provide care during this study, I'm sort of wondering if we can do more than what the sociology department calls putting the mark out. That is basically like provide a safe space to speak, a safe space to cry, to vent, basically. But in the end, like the victim will always like be sent home, and she will just be calmed without addressing the central issues. So as researchers, can we do just more than involuntarily reproduce inequalities that way?
Yeah.
And that's it.
Thank you. I want to say I wish we could be superhumans. No. So to talk about care as a part of the training when we go out and work with sexual violence, I think there are some things that are very inherent to us when we talk to victim survivors of sexual violence, where we always approach, oh, I'm sorry this happened to you, do you want to take a moment for yourself, and stuff like that. So yeah, just acknowledging the person. But I think the care, and this is what I was trying to highlight, is has to be victim survivor centric. So the need to ask what it is that you want or what it is that you need, it still seems so obvious, but it's still very much absent. So it's very shocking that entire universities all over the world are redrafting their sexual violence policies on every ground, but nobody has really sat down with victim survivors and saying, what do you want in this policy? So they'll have all the experts sitting in a room talking about it, but they won't have people who have actually experienced it to talk about it. Until we start to understand what the needs and the demands are, it'll never become care. It'll remain forms of non-care. Because care and non-care always go hand in hand, and it's very sometimes even hard to distinguish the two, but it is. And so Samina Mullah's book, Violence of Care, she says that when you go after an incident to the hospital, the nurse will sit you down, she'll give you a bottle of water, and immediately ask you very personal questions, right? And in that, they're saying, we care for you, and that's why we are asking you. It's a form of care, but it's also a form of non-care. So it's very hard. So till we actually start to sit down and assess the needs. So I think if we are talking about providing care when we are doing research, I think other than creating a kind of trying to remove the politics of exceptionalism in the discourse, is also to actually sit and ask what it is that you wanted. Because it's very strange, but it's true, not everybody wants the perpetrator to necessarily be imprisoned or necessarily be expelled or suspended, but they actually want a certain kind of intervention, a sustained intervention in changing the forms or making sometimes the perpetrator realize what is going on and what the impact it has had. Sometimes they just want the perpetrator to realize the impact they've had on victim survivors. But yeah, so I think even as researchers, sometimes we don't ask, we just take it for granted because we are also within that institutional setting where we go from, oh, this is happening to you, and then we move on to saying, what were the institutional response? But we also don't take a minute to ask what it is that you want, which is to go back to when I was going through the transcripts, and the word care comes up so often. And for the longest time while analyzing the data, I didn't look at care. It was only in the second, like much later when I started to look at the transcripts again, I realized care was important, and it comes up over and over again. So we also have developed our blind spots when we work on this, and this is where it has to change. In terms of if we make it part of the training, will it lose its essence? I don't think so. And the only reason I think it won't lose it because of its victim survivor-centric needs, which takes into account intersectionality, which takes into account diverse experiences. And you talk about it through concrete ways that victim survivors are asking for it. It's kind of experiential learning. It won't be a classroom learning where you're telling them talents. You're actually showing them. You're actually kind of demonstrating what it is that victim survivors would want in the name of the care. Can care survive institutionalization? That's the hope. But it won't be institutionalization again. I mean, just to repeat, if it's victim survivor centric, right? If every case that comes, and again, it might seem I'm being very idealistic, but it comes from the narratives of victim survivors, and I think if we actually sit down and work on it, again, I'm not a policy expert, and sometimes I'm very glad that I'm not, because I can talk like this, is that if you look at together and think about if 80% of victim survivors are asking for a certain kind of step to be taken, then if you take that step, even if it's institutionalized, it would still be care. So I think that institutionalization won't be the worst thing. But of course, there is the entire idea of institution co-opting the language but not really working with it, is where we need to be careful. Well, they would say, yeah, this is care and this is what is said, but it doesn't get implemented, right? Like the idea of no contact order, which very much exists, which has no other repercussion, but university took so long to establish it. Again, I don't know why it took so long to establish it, but it's something that is very easy to do it. So that, of course, we have to remain skeptical and cynical of, and I don't know how that will change. In terms of creating a safe space for victim survivors to talk and to just go back, feeling that they have spoken and maybe re-traumatized and nothing has changed when we speak to them. Yeah, that's how research is. Right? But I think sometimes listening from care perspective itself can be very an act of kindness, rather than having the entire burden of, yes, it requires institutional mechanism, or it has to be reported, or something needs to come out of it. If sometimes when that's not there, it has a difference. It makes a difference in talking to, I mean, almost you seem like you're a therapist, but you're not, and you shouldn't be, absolutely not. But just the less of a baggage to talk about it, I guess, creates certain kind of thing. But yeah, of course that happens, and that's, as a researcher, that's the guilty level of all your life.
Yeah, so I have last question. After, if you have questions, don't hesitate to ask them. So my questions were more about like the link between higher education and care, and is it really possible, actually, not to be to criticize too much higher education institutions, but just to discuss about it, because if we witness, for example, in Sciences Po or in Université Paris Cité, we see that when there is a lack of care, students actually complain about it, or they start to complain about it. They do it actually in Sciences Po and in Université Paris Cité, maybe. And when there is this lack, it's actually students that do some of the work for care, or researchers that do some of the work in their study, or even taking the role of listening to students, etc. So I feel like, yeah, when there is nothing or not much, it's actually students and researchers that work on gender that do the work. And so should we maybe think outside of the institution, and should care, should the work be happening outside of a higher education institution? Not to say that they have nothing to do and they should, because they do nothing, they should do nothing and it should stay like that. But it is, yeah, is it really possible that in an institution where there is hierarchy too between students, teachers, etc., that it can happen, and that it's not always the same people that do the work? What do you think of it?
The optimist in me is like, of course. The pessimist in me is like, of course not. No, but institutions have to care.
Yeah.
I mean, they have to care. And it's not just a statement being made in abstract, or just the frustration of having us research over so many years. Because at the end of the day, when it happens within an institutional space, that's your immediate space. So you rely on certain kind of, like I was saying, certain kind of support, certain kind of reassurance, certain kind of validation, and it has to come from the space that has given you opportunity to learn, but it's within that space that you experience violence. So So there's already a dialogue happening. So institutions can't just say these are the processes or policies we have put in space, you have to deal with it or we can't help it. Because the long-term impact on victim survivors' life is too great for institutions to say only 4 years of your life or 5 years of your life you're here and because that 5 years of life can damage their entire lifetime. So institutions have to care. And this is why the people who do the very hard work of caring and caring labor and caring practices have to remind the institution that it's not only their burden and it's not the burden of the student. And to do this, there have to be involvement. So rather than just saying, your institution doesn't care, so we'll care, which anyways happen and people do, it's to constantly knock at the door and saying, let's talk about care. And not about policies, not about certain kind of mechanisms, but care. I mean, institutions don't think they need to care because they think it's such a gendered thing, it's such a feminine thing, so women teachers can do, marginalized genders can do, and people who are not in power can do. But you have to knock on the door and say, let's talk about care, and say care is nothing abstract or masculine, it doesn't require, and I mean, it has led to a certain kind of hearings and investigations where victim survivors have had small victories. Because I'm not discussing the cases here, so I'm not talking about those, because also I wanted to take permission of the victim survivors and they haven't gotten back to me about it. But they have been able to reach out, and I think people who are like us have to constantly say, why don't we think about care at all? So if you read policies, the care word never appears, right? So, I mean, I absolutely understand that outside care is very important because that's where you actually get it in practical terms. And I have students who have, like, I'm actually part of something called a care committee, where students who go out for their fieldwork and if they experience any kind of violence, they reach out to me and stuff like that.
It's you again.
Yeah, it's me again. So they're like, oh, you're an expert at this.
Yeah.
But when I was being asked to manage this care committee, I got people in the higher-ups also to become part of it. Of course, they like, we don't have time, so you handle the case. And every time a case comes up, I'm like, no, we need to talk about it. And we have a discussion. But again, these are small changes or small initiatives, but I mean, again, if somebody thinks I'm too much of an idealist and I'm okay with it because ideas actually finally turn into something, but I think we have to keep knocking on the doors of people in power and say, where is the care? Where is the care? Where's the word care? Where's the word care? Like, you have to get them upset that when they dream, they think of the word care. Yeah. It has to come to a point where this has to happen. And we can't let it be like, okay, it has to be outside or people who are already doing the work. We have to start getting people on board with that. And this is the reason I'm talking about is, the more I look at the interview transcripts, the more care emerges. And now and I'm not kidding, it literally jumps out of the page headline, because that's how it is spoken about, and that's how much we have ignored it also. So yeah, I don't know, it was a long-winded way of saying we need to hold institutions accountable for care. Okay, the audience questions.
Do you have questions?
Thank you for your presentation, and I really liked your sentence, like, care should not be neglected in the name of justice. It was really simple, but I think it really, it makes lots of sense for me, because what I felt, I'm a Sciences Po student, and when I went through like all the process of VS and victims and those things, I felt like, well, Sciences Po is just making a process for protecting itself in a very judicial way.
Yeah.
And so I encountered people who really seemed to care and to wanted to make things right, but it was like I had to sign a paper saying I didn't want to do things, and it was like, kind of, what do I have to sign a paper? Or one thing, it was I was just asking myself, why isn't there any process for the assaulters and not only for the victims, because it cannot go one without the others, I think.
Yeah.
And what the answer I got was a kind of, well, the direct answer was, for example, for the thing of, I don't know, making things for the assaulters was, it's not possible, because otherwise we would know who is the assaulter, and so guiding to justice would not be possible. Or if you are a victim and we do not help you, then us, the institution, we could get in trouble. So my question is, even if the institution has the intention of helping the people, how can it do so when the whole system, and especially the judiciary system is not here to help?
So this is something I'm grappling with myself, right? And this is something when I talk to the people who are involved in various processes at Sciences Po and Université Paris and in US College. It's very hard because of course there are limitations to everything, and it's how do you, when an institution even has the right intention to care, but the law itself. And this is a discussion I was having, and this is something I still need to talk to people who are in positions who are kind of drafting and changing. At what point and how much autonomy can a university exercise? According to me, it's quite a bit. I'm talking about NUS and not Sciences Po Université Cité Paris, because I have not done research here. Establishing in-house processes and making them work is not hard. I mean, implementation and execution, like I said, is not always the way it's intended to be. But even in the law, I think university can on its own do more than they think they can. I think they have to really stretch the boundary and see where it lands them. But the question is, are they willing to take the risk? But law, judiciary is like that, because like I was talking in the paper, and I don't know how clear it was, that these both are very paternalistic institutions and based on patriarchy. So they have a seamless conversation with each other. That yes, you are like this, we are like that, we are going to support each other. It's like a bro kind of relationship where they support each other, right? And that's where the fracture has to come, and of course, as I argue, the care is the fracture. I know I'm not answering your questions directly because I'm not sure how much a university can challenge the outside law and implement its own processes. But in Singapore, that's where my research is. Universities have enough space to stretch itself and meet the needs of the victim survivor in most cases, if it has really wanted to. And especially when the media gets involved, it has really stretched itself. So I think, yeah, I'm sorry I don't have a direct answer, but yeah, I'm grappling with that too, that even when a university wants to do, and there are outside laws, and there is this wall that the university keeps hitting, what can be done? And this is when we need to talk to the policy experts, which I haven't done yet. Sorry.
You thank for the very enlightening speech as a pleasure. You talked a lot about victim-centric care, and I was curious about how do you behave with victims who are not able to care for themselves and who have to learn or who have no idea and who might feel like the responsibility is put on them when they have to make themselves understood and cared for, because it requires a level of intelligibility of your needs.
Yeah,
and
of course.
it's an effort. So I was just curious about how you dealt with that part.
So I'm going to answer this question in educational setting and non-educational setting.
All right.
So I agree that you need intelligibility and emotional intelligibility to engage in these kind of cases with victim survivors. I think how you approach care when the need is, it almost always, or most of the time, to be less confident of myself, it appears as frustrations. It'll come across as something that infuriates them, it frustrates them, and that's when you try to see how you can ease it, which becomes a care method. So, like the first example I gave, where the person said, they didn't even ask me how you are doing. Something as simple as that, right? That's a frustration, right? That's infuriation, that I am a victim survivor, I am going to report, I am taking that responsibility, and yet I'm not, there is no reciprocity. So you pick up on that, and you say, oh, this is what the person needs, an acknowledgement, needs a validation, needs the confidence that yes, this has happened and there are people to stand by them, right? And that's when you start to ask what it is that you want, and that what it is that you need, what has happened with you, what would you have want things to be differently than what has been done, right? So at that point you start asking questions from the anger, the frustration, the infuriation that you see. So it doesn't have to come across necessarily as helplessness or vulnerability or as somebody constantly crying. It doesn't actually. What it comes across most of the time is anger. So one of the first quote when I started discussing articulations of care was, they don't give a shit about us, right? So that's a very powerful thing, and that's when you start to break it down to say, how would you like what forms would you like to be taken care of or taken seriously? So I think, so that kind of intelligibility is needed, and as researchers, as more and more you speak, you literally learn on the job, unfortunately, and this is something, and I mean, of course, we now, the four of us here, of course, can start to combine, compile, and write about it, and this is what I'm doing. Like what I said, I'm creating this entire huge kind of thread to say, these are the things that victim survivors said, which are indications of care that they needed. So that's the intelligibility. You decide to not only look at vulnerability and crying and helplessness as wanting care, but anger, infuriation, challenges, discontent as also needs care, that they are demanding care. Outside of institutions, it's been when I work with women who have experienced violence, they actually talk about how they give care and how they have not received care. So they'll say, if this happened to my friend and I did this, but when it happened to me, nobody gave me the same kind of treatment. So you realize that they have a certain kind of care that they want applied to themselves. And that's when you start to understand how contextual care is, because their care practices are what they want to be applied to them, which is again becomes very diverse, very intersectional, but that's where the value opens. Does that answer the question?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
First of all, thank you for the very, very interesting lecture. So I have two questions. The first one is that you mentioned the lack of a care-centric, a victim survivor-centric approach to this issue. I wonder if this has much to do with the fact that in the policy making and also in the service of anti-sexual harassment and sexual attacks, in these institutions, there is a lack of representation from the students themselves, especially the victim survivors. And I wonder if there is a possibility to make them more involved in making the policies and also providing this care, like mutual care between the victim survivors. That's my first question. And the second question concerns the fact that you mentioned penalties towards the perpetrators. And it seems that different victim survivors have different desires as to how the perpetrators should be punished. So I wonder, because there is a sentiment among many feminists, it seems that to give very harsh penalties to the perpetrators. But I wonder, from a victim survivor point of view, is this always the case? Is this always in the best interest for the victim survivors? Thank you.
Thank you. Those are really good questions. So for the first one, yes, that's something that when I was part of redrafting sexual violence policy, I think the victim survivors who have reached a point where they want to be involved in the policy making process and redrafting of it should be involved. And surprisingly, there were a lot of victim survivors who wanted to be part of it. But the logic was, oh, they are too emotional and they're too invested, they have no objectivity, so do we want them? And I said yes, but of course I'm one voice. But yeah, so they were actually not taking, their merit was that not that they have experience so they can actually contribute, but that they're too emotional and they would be not objective enough in terms of policy making, because policy has to be objective. So this was an argument against, but something that's something that I've always believed in, and a lot of people, that yes, victim survivors have to be part of the policy making because they come from the point of experience and their experiences are invaluable. But of course, the way policy making happens is very different. It's very, very objective, very detached, very rational. So that kind of equation is constantly at play, and while I think that would be itself, like, yes, a part of caregiving and a part of at least initiating caregiving, it has been objected to in the past in my experience. So yeah, but of course you're right that should be one way that we express care and think about caring, which again brings back the care on the same bodies that have experienced violence, but at least it'll initiate care process. In terms of penalties, the sentiment towards perpetrator and how do we, it's a tough question. But I think most of the institutions, and as far as my research went, this is very coming from my own research, victim survivors actually want universities to invest with the perpetrator and make them understand what they have done is so damaging, it's so devastating, that they should not repeat. The idea is that they should not repeat more than anything else. It's not to actually expel them or suspend them, because that results in nothing, because they might find some other university that could take them, they can get hired somewhere else, but the idea is non-repetition. But that requires a lot of the effort of the institution to invest in training, in counseling, and everything. Would the institution want to do that? If they are not investing enough time, energy, resources for the victim survivors, will they invest it for the perpetrator? So it's also the idea of time and resources that we need to do, but I don't think it's an open idea, or that it's idea that yes, the only way of finding justice is to actually expel them or fire them. Firing is never enough. Expelling them is never enough. Actually, to one of the ways is to actually show them that this repetition won't happen. And I think that's a form of justice and care that's usually not taken into account. And so yeah, that's my answer for that. That institution actually doesn't want to invest in perpetrators, but it needs to invest in perpetrators too.
I have another question. So I know it's a talk on victim survivors, but I'm also curious about what you would recommend for perpetrators, in the sense that you might be in the vicinity of someone who perpetrates. It can also be a loved one, and like how do you participate in like, should you care for them? I'm sorry, it just
No. It's a good question.
You know, like it had happened to me, and I just because you have interesting answers, so I was just curious.
I mean, we should sit and talk about it, because I remember we were, and this is an incident I'm saying because we were having this first responder sexual training for the staff at my college, and we were all sitting and we were talking about what victim survivors want and how to address what they want, and what if the perpetrator and victim survivors in the same room, what do we do? And so this colleague of mine, who shall not be named, it was constantly making the victim survivors sound very irrational, like what if they want this and we can't do this, what if they, and then if they keep saying that they don't want anything to be done, are we doing a kind of injustice to them? And my response was, and of course my response came out of frustration again, was, do you know how many of us co-inhabit with the perpetrators? Nobody even knows. Like, how many of us are sitting here and our perpetrators would be sitting next to us and nobody knows. So it's okay, when victim survivors say they don't want anything done, they don't want anything done. There's a reason for it, and there will be a point when they might want something done. And this is one of my interlocutors also said, that university has to be patient. You can't rush this process, you have to be patient and see what they want at the end of it. So what do you do when it's a loved one? That's what violence studies has been dealing with, feminist violence studies has been dealing with. Because it's not easy to walk away, but it's not easy to live. So you start negotiating, you start forming your ways of coping. Sometimes those coping mechanisms work, sometimes they fail miserably. So I have no answer, but I can talk about it with you if you want. Thank you. Yeah.
You talked about the fact that institutions have to care, and I'm just wondering, like, how do we make them care? Because so we talked about the fact that Me Too was an opportunity, but it brings an issue with reputation, public image, and so I was actually quite surprised to see that there is no negative consequences in terms of public image for all these perpetrations of violence, and how come it doesn't have negative impact? Like, how come they don't care already, and that they just want to do damage control instead of saying, well, we're an institution who cares, and we are taking care of our victims and trying to help them and accompany them. That should have a positive impact on public image. So why don't they care?
Yeah, that's what I was talking about, politics of exceptionalism, because they say, oh, our university is such a safe space. All instances of violence are exceptions. And so when it happens, actually they do have a negative image. I mean, publicly, at least what I've heard of Sciences Po or NUS, let me talk about NUS, and the 4 cases were made public, and then there were a few more. It was said, oh, NUS is a capital of violence for women, or if you want to get violated, then you go to NUS and stuff like that. So there was a negative image around NUS when it happened, and that's why it went into damage control mode. It immediately went to how to appease the public, how to make sure the trustees and the board and everybody is pacified. So in that moment, it got into the mode of saving its reputation and not caring about the victim survivors at all, and not seeing that caring about them but this has to come where every university or institution not just has to say, yes, violence occurs. Yes, it's an everyday phenomenon. It's because the society, the structures of society perpetuate violence, and educational institutions are part of that society. So it's okay for violence to happen. They have to set themselves, like I said, aside for how well they care, how well they manage the cases, how well they deal with victim survivors. But because they try to deny it, and politics of exceptionalism, that, oh, it's an exceptional cases that these things happen. We are almost perfect till the point. Right? So of course, this is the problem of politics of exceptionalism, which politics of exceptionalism can be studied in many other areas as well. But how do we make university care? Of course, there are different ways. It's of course policies that can be reformatted, there can be training, there can be actually, all institutions have units that take care of sexual violence. They need to be given a certain autonomy, they need to be funded. They need to have a certain kind of leeway to deal with fluidity and the diversity of cases that come, which are usually not given. They're constantly, and again, in these units, they're mostly women. They're mostly women from marginalized sections. So when they actually demand something, it's easy to make them go unheard. So university can do a lot. You just have to not give up on to get university to actually think about care. So it's, yeah, you can't give up, because violence is going to continue happening and there will be victim survivors. So you have to constantly remind them that, not remind, actually you have to keep reinstating into them that care can happen, and care can happen in multiple ways. But first step is to disengage with politics of exceptionalism and set themselves that the way their reputation is going to go up is when they handle the cases well. When victim survivors come and say, this university was by my side and they did so well in handling my case. There has to be that change in their entire attitude, which of course seems again very idle. I don't know how, but I'm hoping it will happen eventually. again, the optimist in me doesn't let that go away. Yeah.
Can you just comment what was said regarding how can we get out from this policy of exceptionalism through research? This is what we intend to do by a big survey trying to shed light. And it has been done in different universities in France, for instance. It could come from student initiatives, but it could also come from researchers most of the time, but also with people who are working for the institution in those specific unit dedicated to tackle gender-based violence. So just to kind of have a picture of more positive regarding.
Of course.
Because when we say institution, what are we talking about exactly? Who are these institutions? This is a bunch of people within this part of people. Some are very caring about this issue, some not. Some are totally don't know exactly the scope of these types of violence. That's why we need first to document them. And then also they have to do their job to find solutions.
Yes. So of course we have been talking about the top management, but of course institutions are various stakeholders. Thank you for pointing that out. Yeah, absolutely, 100%. Yeah. So this research will be part of caring, I hope. Yeah. Any other question? Okay. Thank you so much.